Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Dark Narrations. Tonight, I've brought you a chilling descent into the ancient darkness of the Appalachian Trail, a place where some of the oldest mountains on Earth hold secrets far older and far more terrifying than anything whispered around a campfire. In this episode, we're venturing deep into the shadowed corridors of Appalachia with 8 of the most disturbing, true horror stories ever reported by those who dared to walk these secluded paths. These aren't exaggerated legends or recycled folktales. These accounts come straight from the men and women who survived encounters that defy every explanation offered by logic or science. These trails may look peaceful to the untrained eye, but anyone who's wandered too far from the safety of daylight knows the truth. Something ancient watches from between the trees. Something that has lived here long before the first footsteps ever touched these ridges. Tonight you'll hear from hikers who realized they were being tracked by something not quite human. Wanderers who stumbled into places locals warn outsiders never to step into, and travelers who learned too late why some paths vanish from maps over time. For the protection of those brave enough to share what they endured, a few names and locations have been altered, but the terror at the heart of each encounter remains exactly as it happened. These mountains hide what they do for a reason, and once you hear the truth behind what lurks in these forests, you'll understand why some trails are better left untrodden. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to Scary Dark Narrations for nightly true horror stories that will haunt your thoughts long after the video ends. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss the moments when the darkness of these hills begins to whisper again.
Please, somebody help me! Oh God, it's right behind me!
The forest was alive, but not in the way I expected. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every whisper of wind through the pines, seemed amplified, as if the trees themselves were listening. I had planned this hike for months, each mile meticulously plotted, my pack carefully balanced, my water filtered and food rationed with precision. The Appalachian Trail stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of earth curling through Virginia's mountains, promising solitude and a quiet communion with nature. I had stayed in shelters before, but this time I wanted a section of the trail to myself. The isolation, a welcome companion for my thoughts and the weight of my own independence. The morning mist lingered like a thin veil over the valleys, softening edges and making the world feel simultaneously ethereal and fragile. Then I heard a faint rustle behind me, a footfall that wasn't my own, and a voice calling out, warm, casual, human. He introduced himself as Marcus, his tone light and easy, the kind of voice that could make anyone drop their guard. He was tall, lean, tanned from months under the sun, carrying a pack that had clearly seen more trails than I had. His stories flowed effortlessly, tales of Georgia, of mountains and sunsets, of mistakes that were funny only in hindsight. I laughed, genuinely, feeling a camaraderie I hadn't expected to find on the trail so early in my hike. He said he was headed to Jenkins' shelter, just like me, and relief fluttered in my chest. The thought of sharing the shelter, of not being completely alone in the vastness of the wilderness, was comforting. As we walked, shadows seemed to bend slightly at the edges of my vision, leaves rustled in ways that didn't match the wind, and I felt a subtle shiver pass over me. By afternoon, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the mountains in a wash of gold and amber, and I felt the familiar ache in my shoulders from the pack's weight. Marcus pointed out landmarks, told me which stretches were deceptively steep, which streams were safe to drink from, and which paths led to sudden drop-offs. His phone showed pictures of landscapes he claimed to have captured, each one more stunning than the last, and I found myself relaxing completely. There was nothing in the air to hint at danger, nothing in his manner to warn me, and yet a faint unease lingered, a tugging at the edge of my consciousness that I ignored. The trail narrowed, sunlight fading, and the quiet around us became thick, almost tangible. Every snap of a branch behind me made me glance over my shoulder, but Marcus laughed softly and kept walking, reassuring me that the forest was always full of small sounds, of squirrels, of birds, of nothing to fear. And yet, the wind scraped across the trees like skeletal fingers, brushing my neck and making my skin prickle. We reached Jenkins' shelter just before sunset, its wooden frame simple and familiar, a fire ring out front and a bare box tucked to the side. The evening air was sharp and crisp, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the sky was streaked with clouds painted pink and violet. We filtered water from the creek nearby, set up our gear, and Marcus built a small fire, flames licking the darkening edges of the shelter. Conversation drifted easily, laughter and stories filling the air as darkness wrapped itself around the forest. I felt safe, almost too safe, lulled into the illusion that familiarity could shield me. But as the last light disappeared, the shadows inside the shelter seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching toward me in slow, deliberate arcs. Then, silence swallowed everything. I woke to a hand pressing firmly over my mouth, the sudden pressure crushing my voice, and the weight of a body on top of me, impossibly close. Panic flared instantly, adrenaline ripping through every fiber of my being, and the familiar warmth of Marcus's friendly presence was gone, replaced by a cold, deliberate menace. His breath, tinged with smoke from the dying fire outside, brushed against my ear, and his whisper cut through the dark. If I made a sound, he promised I would regret it. I forced my mind to focus, to stay calm, to breathe slowly despite the terror coursing through me. I waited for a moment of weakness, a fraction of distraction, and when it came, I acted on instinct. My elbow struck his ribs with all the force I could muster, his grip loosening as he grunted in pain. I scrambled free, the floor cold beneath my bare feet, my heart hammering, and ran blind, frantic, propelled by sheer will. The forest swallowed me immediately, branches clawing at my skin, roots tripping my feet, the ground uneven and merciless. Behind me, his shouts echoed, sharp and chilling, carrying the authority of someone who thought the world could bend to his control. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only thought was distance, escape, survival. My breaths came in jagged gasps, blood stinging from cuts I hadn't noticed until I collapsed briefly behind a fallen log. The underbrush was thick, almost sentient, concealing me as I pressed myself into the damp earth, listening. His steps were deliberate, searching, taunting, but the shadows that had once seemed strange now became my ally. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning until the first hints of dawn filtered through the trees, pale and gray, illuminating the path forward with uncertain light. Every step toward civilization was agony, each footfall tearing at my bleeding feet, every rustle of leaves threatening discovery. I stumbled onto a Forest Service road, muscles screaming, lungs on fire, but relief came in the form of a pickup truck, a hunter behind the wheel who recognized my state immediately. The police arrived, questions were asked, statements given, and yet the terror lingered, a residue that clung to every nerve ending. Investigation revealed a truth worse than I could have imagined. Marcus was not Marcus. Michael Davenport, wanted for previous assaults across multiple states, had lived along the trail for months, slipping between shelters and trail towns, his charm a mask for a predator who had been hunting long before me. The realization that my trust had been weaponized, that my instincts hadn't warned me fast enough, made the forest feel simultaneously familiar and alien. Every shadow seemed to whisper his presence. Every quiet evening carried the echo of his steps, and I knew that fear could not be silenced by distance alone. Months turned into years, therapy into support groups. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt what had been shattered, but the trail still called, and 5 years later, I returned not to Jenkins' shelter, but to a safer section, accompanied by friends, safety precautions layered like armor around me. Nature's beauty returned, tentative at first, then bold, a reclamation of my love for the wilderness. Yet the memory of that night remained embedded in every pine needle and rushing stream. I became an advocate for trail safety, sharing my story openly, warning others of predators hidden among those we think we can trust, teaching that vigilance and instinct are as critical as maps and water filters. And yet, even now, as I hike and the wind whistles through the mountains, I feel it, the lingering presence of a shadow I cannot see, a reminder that evil sometimes walks in plain sight, smiling, patient, waiting for the next person who believes in safety too soon. Would you dare return to this place?
Join us. You can't leave. Stay with us forever.
I remember the way the morning mist hung low over the Appalachian Trail, curling around the pine trunks like ghostly fingers, and how the smell of wet earth felt almost suffocating in its intensity. My boots sank into the damp soil as I started the final section I had been chasing for over a decade, that last 200 miles of trail that would complete my journey. I had been meticulous in planning, maps folded perfectly in my backpack, weather apps checked every hour, gear laid out with military precision, and yet a quiet tension hummed beneath the surface, a whisper in my mind that something was off. My routine had always been my shield, meticulous check-ins with Emma, my careful pacing, and the methodical way I plotted each day's hike. But as the sun dipped behind the ridges, shadows began stretching in impossible directions, bending over rocks and roots in ways that didn't make sense. A bird would cry out and vanish instantly, leaving the silence to grow heavy around me. It was subtle at first, barely noticeably a snapped twig that couldn't be mine, a rustle behind me that didn't match the wind but it gnawed at the edge of my consciousness. I paused at the Lehigh Gap overlook, the wind scraping across the rocks like skeletal fingers, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, a rapid drumbeat that seemed far too loud in the stillness. I pulled my jacket tighter and tried to laugh off the unease, telling myself it was just isolation playing tricks, that the Appalachian Trail had always been remote and indifferent. My phone buzzed Emma's text, always a lifeline telling me she hoped I had eaten something for lunch and asking if the trail was treating me well. I typed back a brief reply, making good time where they're holding. HOH, my own acronym for hike your own hike, but even as I sent it, a chill rolled down my spine. The forest had shifted somehow. The familiar trail markers looked skewed, twisted. The stream I crossed glimmered under the sun, but the reflection in the water was wrong. It seemed too deep, darkened, almost like it had a current pulling at something unseen beneath its surface. My eyes searched the banks, but there was nothing at all. By the third day, I was climbing rocky ridges, muscles screaming from the effort, but my mind was consumed by a growing unease I couldn't shake. I had learned to read the forest like a book, to notice the smallest irregularity, a broken branch, footprints, but that day the woods felt alive in a way that was wrong. Listening, waiting. My calls to Emma were cheerful. I joked about sore feet and the stubborn incline, but each time I hung up, I felt watched, and the silence that followed was thicker than any forest fog. The night settled in quickly, and I made camp near a flat clearing, preparing to eat the pasta I had packed, my hands trembling just slightly as I set up my tent. There was a moment, a heartbeat, where I thought I heard whispers, faint as the rustling leaves, and yet distinctly human. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind or my mind, but the hairs on my arms stood at rigid attention. Then, silence swallowed everything. Morning came, pale and fragile, the mist curling again like smoke over the ridge. I stepped out of my tent, and everything was wrong. My backpack leaned against the tree as I had left it, but the essential items, the water filter, my headlamp, first aid kit, were missing. My own hands felt useless, unarmed against a world that had shifted in a single night. The stream nearby murmured softly, and when I followed its edge, my boots sliding in mud, the trail that should have continued clearly vanished, or maybe had never been there at all. Every logical explanation evaporated with the fog. My mind, trained in navigation, in wilderness survival, screamed at me to retrace steps, to rationalize, but the landscape refused to obey reason. Somewhere in the woods, a presence waited, impossible to name, yet undeniably aware of me. And just as I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, something too fast, too deliberate, I realized I was not alone. Something was shaping the trail itself, folding it, hiding me, bending reality around me. The forest closed in, narrowing paths and amplifying every sound, the crunch of a leaf, the snap of a twig, even the hum of distant insects now sounding like whispered warnings. I moved faster, heart hammering, trying to retrace my steps, but the landscape resisted me, shifting subtly with every glance over my shoulder. Shadows stretched, breaking geometry, elongating where no light could naturally fall, and the wind's song became almost articulate, as though it carried murmured words I couldn't quite grasp. My breath came in ragged gasps. I screamed into the mist, a sound swallowed immediately by the thick canopy above. The woods seemed infinite, looping, folding back on themselves, and my compass spun wildly, unable to find true north. I stumbled across my own footprints from hours ago, except they were slightly misaligned, as though someone else had walked in parallel, copying my every step. Panic mounted as daylight fractured, slipping between the trees like liquid gold that illuminated glimpses of movement just beyond the corner of my eyes. The trail itself now seemed malicious, rocks rising where none had been, roots twisting into grasping hands. I thought of Emma, imagined her frantic face, and called her name into the cold, unfeeling void. My voice echoed back at me, warped and layered, as if multiple versions of myself answered from different corners of the forest. Then the calm hit, like a pause in a symphony before the crescendo. I reached a clearing where the trees had parted in an unnatural circle, and everything stopped. No wind, no birds, no whispers, just a deep, perfect silence. My stomach knotted, instincts screaming to flee, but my legs froze, the sensation crawling up my spine. In that silence, the air shimmered as if reality itself was bending, and I caught a glimpse just for a heartbeat of a figure blurred. Standing where nothing should be, I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, branches slashing my arms, mud sucking at my boots. Every attempt to escape the forest only brought me deeper into it. The sounds multiplied, footsteps that didn't belong to me, faint whispers that mimicked my own breathing, laughter without source. The world fractured, time fractured. I turned around to look, and the clearing I had fled from was now behind me but somehow also ahead, mirrored, impossible. My mind began to unravel, memories flickering. Had I passed this place already, or had I never arrived? Panic became instinct. I ducked behind a rock as something moved through the trees, a shadow so fluid it shouldn't exist, its shape human yet grotesquely wrong. I dared not breathe. The wind carried a sound I will never forget, her quiet, deliberate dragging, as though something unseen was following, observing, measuring my fear. I stumbled upon a stream, and the water's surface was a perfect mirror, but my reflection did not mimic me. It smiled when I did not. My hands reached for it, only to be met with freezing cold that seemed to pull at me, urging me forward. Every logical thought screamed, retreat, but the reflection and something deeper, beyond sight beckoned me. I stepped in, the current slick and unnaturally still, and felt the world fold. The forest behind me vanished, my boot slipped, and for an instant I was falling sideways, backwards, and forwards simultaneously. And then nothing. Silence again. My own voice was gone. The trail was gone. The day had folded over itself into a void where I could neither climb nor descend, neither move forward nor back. I woke, or thought I did, in a clearing that was familiar yet entirely alien. My backpack lay beside me, intact this time, the tent half erected. The pastor sat cold, untouched, and the world smelled of wet leaves and fire smoke, but no breeze stirred. I called Emma's name, no answer, and then the faintest whisper drifted through the trees, a syllable of recognition, a hint of my own name, Hunter, stretching and bending with the wind. I tried to follow it, stepping off the clearing, only to find the path had vanished again. I am trapped in loops, or perhaps erased from time. My own story is unspooling, memory unraveling with each step, leaving only fear, only the impossible trail that shifts whenever I look. And though I have survived, if surviving means this, I am no longer sure what is real, what is mine, or if I will ever find my way back. Would you dare return to this place? The wind scraped across the shelter's wooden walls like skeletal fingers, and I felt it crawl along my spine. I had always loved the Appalachian Trail, the way the mountains whispered stories older than anyone could remember, but that night, the forest felt different. Each leaf seemed to twitch under an unseen gaze, and the distant howl of the wind carried a melody I couldn't place. I had joined this hiking group to escape the clutter of my life, the papers, the deadlines, the relentless hum of city existence. My backpack felt heavier than usual, though I had packed nothing extraordinary, and the air smelled damp, like earth and decay, but oddly sweet in a way that made my stomach twist. As we walked the final stretch toward Barafent's mountain hut, the sun dipped low, and shadows grew long, stretching unnaturally across the trail, as if the trees themselves were reaching for us. I shook off the sensation, reminding myself that nerves played tricks on hikers, especially near sunset. The hut appeared around a bend, its simple three-sided frame promising shelter, warmth, and routine. Inside, the familiar smell of pine and resin mingled with the faint tang of yesterday's campfire, grounding me in normalcy. My companions moved with practiced ease, unpacking sleeping bags, filtering water, and preparing our small meals. I laughed at a joke someone made about their failed attempt to catch fish, and for a moment, I felt the kind of camaraderie that makes the world seem right. But then I heard it, a faint whistling, so delicate it might have been the wind, yet it carried a cadence almost human, teasing and deliberate. I froze, turning my head toward the tree line, but my friends were busy with their chores, oblivious to the sound that pricked at my nerves. I told myself I was imagining things, the mind conjuring music where none existed, yet my pulse accelerated, and the air around me felt denser, heavier. Night settled faster than expected. Shadows pooled in corners of the hut, blackening the familiar wooden slats, and I felt my breath come uneven, my pulse a rapid drum. I arranged my sleeping bag in the middle of the platform, between two friends, grateful for the security of proximity. The rustle of leaves outside seemed louder than it should, a constant reminder that the wilderness never truly sleeps. I wrote in my journal briefly, noting the day's hike, the burn in my legs, the vibrant reds and golds of the foliage. But the last line lingered as I scribbled it. Heard something in the trees tonight. Strange whistling sound. Going to investigate after everyone falls asleep. Want to see if it is an owl species I am not familiar with. My pen trembled slightly, though I didn't know if it was excitement or unease. I could hear my friends breathing, each exhale a rhythm of comfort and distraction, but I couldn't ignore the pull, the sound in the trees, weaving through my mind, calling me. The darkness pressed against the hut's open sides, and I could feel it inching closer, curling around my legs, my arms, the nape of my neck. My eyes flicked toward the windowless corners, where shapes seemed to shift if I dared to stare too long. The autumn night smelled richer now, sharper pine resin mixed with a metallic tint, like copper left out in the rain. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to be rational, to trust the warmth of the group's chatter. And yet something deeper, older, unnameable, whispered that leaving would bring clarity. Then, silence swallowed everything. I woke, or thought I did, to the brush of cold air against my arm, the forest pressing closer than it had before. The whistling had grown, closer now, and undeniably melodic, curling around me, coaxing me toward the dark. My boots sat neatly by the platform, my backpack in its usual corner, yet I felt compelled to move, to step beyond the shelter's protection. Each step on the moss-covered trail sounded like thunder in my ears. Yet I felt no fear, only a pulling curiosity, a need to follow the sound, to see its source. The trees stretched impossibly tall, their branches forming twisted silhouettes that danced against the moonlight, shadows bending in ways no natural light should permit. I walked barefoot, the forest floor cold and damp, each stone pressing sharply into my soles, each root tangling around my ankles. The trail that had been familiar during the day now seemed alien, twisted, looping back on itself in ways I could not recognize. I paused at a rocky outcrop, the scent of pine thick and cloying, and realized I had lost the trail entirely. Yet the whistling persisted, a siren song just ahead, carrying notes that seemed both alive and deliberate, each one threading itself into my heartbeat. The wind shifted, cold fingers brushing my neck, and I could have sworn I heard whispers entwined with the whistling, speaking words I could not understand but felt deeply, in my chest, in my mind. Suddenly, the sound vanished, replaced by a suffocating quiet. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs, and the only movement was the trembling of leaves around me. I realized the jackets, the backpacks, the lights of the hut, everything I had known were now impossibly far away. Panic surged, yet I could not turn back. My body moved independently, guided by something unseen. Then, in the clearing ahead, I saw it, a tree, impossibly tall, with a branch suspended 7 feet off the ground, a fleece jacket draped over it, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Recognition struck like lightning. My own jacket, impossible, unreachable, hanging there as if placed by a hand taller than mine, larger than human. I stepped closer, the wind carrying a low vibrating hum, and felt time stretch, the night elongating around me. My mind raced, trying to rationalize a hallucination, a prank, a trick of the wind, but logic dissolved as I stared at the jacket, untouched by any footprints I could find. Then the forest shifted again. Shadows moved against my vision, bending around rocks and trees in impossible ways, as if the woods themselves were alive. The whistling returned, now a chorus, circling, echoing, and I realized that the sound had been tracking me, guiding me, and perhaps waiting for me. My voice caught in my throat as a realization sank in. I was utterly alone, yet not alone at all. Something was watching, something that did not belong to this world. My legs moved faster now, stumbling through brambles, yet the forest did not allow escape. Paths twisted back upon themselves, the scent of pine thickening into something almost organic, pulsing with intent. The moonlight fractured, leaving me in strobing patterns of shadow and light, and then I was gone. Not entirely, not in memory, but in the physical world. My trace evaporated beyond the reach of dogs, of helicopters, of desperate hands clawing through underbrush. Only my jacket remained, suspended like a message, a monument, a warning. Years may pass, seasons may change, but the woods remember. The Appalachian Trail continues, hikers passing unaware, yet the night I walked into that darkness will never forget me. Would you dare return to this place, knowing the forest listens, knows, waits? Would you step beyond the safety of wood and firelight, trusting the melody of something unseen? Audrey Chen vanished, leaving behind only whispers, shadows, and a jacket hung impossibly high. And as the trail stretches on, winding through mountain and fog, the forest keeps its secrets, patient, eternal, and utterly silent to those who ignore its call. I knew something was wrong the moment the wind scraped across the shelter roof like skeletal fingers, and a chill settled so deep into my chest it felt like a warning I wasn't supposed to ignore. I had come to the Appalachian Trail to escape the burnout eating me alive, hoping the quiet could smooth the noise in my head. But instead, the silence felt too heavy, as if something unseen was holding its breath around me. Each step through the Virginia woods felt oddly watched, the trees leaning in just a little too close, their shadows stretching longer than the sinking sun. I tried telling myself it was just exhaustion from the 12-mile day, but the unease clung to me like damp air that refused to lift. Still, I pushed on, telling myself a few nights alone in the wilderness would reset everything that had been unraveling inside me. I never imagined that this hike, this final attempt at peace, would be the last time anyone ever saw me alive. I reached the shelter just before sunset, the ridge glowing in a soft orange haze that made the valley below look endless and dreamlike. And for a moment, I felt the calm I'd been craving for months. The shelter itself was older than I expected, with beams darkened by decades of weather and a faint smell of charred wood that reminded me of old campfires and forgotten stories. A couple from Ohio had already set up for the night, cheerful in that friendly, trail-heartened way that made you instantly feel less alone out here. We talked casually as we boiled water and swapped stories, and their presence steadied me more than I wanted to admit. But when the fourth hiker arrived, a man calling himself Rick, something inside me tightened before I even understood why. He nodded politely, yet his eyes never settled, always shifting, always observing, as if he was cataloging every detail about us. I tried shaking off the feeling, but the trail had taught me long ago that instincts rarely lied. We gathered around the fire as darkness thickened around the woods, and the flames cast long, trembling silhouettes across the beams, stretching the shadows like living things. The couple chatted in the relaxed way older hikers do, but Rick kept his distance, carving lines into a battered notebook while barely contributing to the conversation. Every time I glanced toward him, he seemed already aware, like he'd been waiting for me to look, offering a faint smile that never reached his eyes. I told myself he was just socially awkward, another wanderer escaping life for a few weeks, but there was something deliberate in his detachment, something that made the hairs on my arms rise. When the couple eventually went to sleep, the shelter fell into a quieter rhythm, the fire crackling softly as its glow flickered against the wooden slats. Rick and I talked, our voices low, but even then, something felt off, his questions too pointed, his pauses too long, as though he wasn't listening for answers but for reactions. If I'd trusted that unease instead of brushing it aside, maybe everything would have ended differently. As the night deepened, an eerie stillness crept into the woods, the kind that makes every sound feel magnified, every silence feel intentional. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustling of leaves outside, but the forest sounded wrong, too quiet, as if the animals themselves were hiding from something moving between the trees. Every few minutes, I thought I heard soft footsteps near the shelter, deliberate and faint, like someone pacing just out of sight. I lifted my head more than once, staring toward the door, expecting to see the silhouette of a hiker returning late, but the opening remained empty and dark. I tried closing my eyes and slowing my breathing, yet my pulse hammered so hard I felt it echo in my ears. When I finally drifted toward sleep, it wasn't comfort pulling me under. It was the sense that consciousness felt suddenly heavier, harder to hold on to. I'd later wonder if I actually fell asleep at all, or if something else lulled me into a stillness I couldn't escape. Sometime deep in the night, a whisper of movement jolted me back awake, soft, careful, familiar enough to freeze my breath. I didn't open my eyes at first, trying to place the sound, but the shift of weight on the old wooden boards made my stomach drop. Someone was moving inside the shelter, slow and measured, as if trying to avoid waking anyone. I forced myself to breathe normally, afraid that any sign of awareness might provoke whoever stood over us. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of cold metal and burned paper, and an instinctive dread crawled across my spine. When I finally cracked my eyes open, only a sliver, I saw a figure crouched near the dying firelight, their outline sharp against the faint glow. I didn't know it then, but this was the last moment before everything spiraled into darkness. And then the shelter went silent. Then silence swallowed everything. The moment the silence settled, a sharp instinct jolted through me, urging me to stay still as the figure's head shifted toward my direction, its motion too smooth, too certain. My heartbeat thudded against the sleeping bag, each pulse a dull hammer that I feared might give me away. I sensed him before I fully understood Rick, or whoever he really was, moving with the slow confidence of someone who already knew the outcome of this night. He crouched over his own gear at first, but the faint metallic click that followed made my blood turn cold. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too deeply, because something in that sound carried finality, like a door closing for the last time. Have you ever felt danger before you saw it? The way the air changes, the way your skin knows the truth before your mind catches up. That's exactly how it felt. Like death was leaning over me, studying me in the dark. The wooden boards creaked once more, sharper this time, followed by the soft drag of a boot across grit, inching closer to where I lay pretending to sleep. My eyes stayed almost closed, just a thin veil between me and the figure standing over me, his outline framed by the faint embers still glowing in the fire pit. The metallic glint in his hand caught the dim light, and the shape was unmistakable. A small caliber pistol, held steady, like he'd rehearsed this. My breathing slowed on instinct, my mind racing with questions that didn't matter anymore, because every second felt like it might be my last. The air around him felt colder than the rest of the shelter, as though the shadows themselves bent toward him, hiding his features. He didn't move for several seconds, just watching, listening, measuring every sound I made. And I thought, why me? Why did he choose me? When he finally backed away, the wooden floor sighing beneath his steps, a trembling breath escaped me that I couldn't suppress, and the slightest twitch of my fingers betrayed I was awake. His turn was immediate, a sudden, sharp pivot that made my pulse spike so violently I thought I would faint before anything happened. He stepped closer again, and I felt the barrel of cold metal brush against the fabric near my shoulder, hovering, as if deciding whether to finish what he'd come to do. My mind spun through 1,000 thoughts, my parents, Lisa, the projects I'd abandoned at work, all the things I'd planned for after this trip, yet none of them felt real anymore. All that existed was the darkness, the gun, and the stranger breathing steadily above me. For one awful moment, I thought he would pull the trigger, but instead, he whispered something too soft to understand, a sound so faint it almost felt imagined. Then he stepped back, and walked out into the night. I didn't move for several minutes, terrified he might return, listening to the fading crunch of his boots on the trail until the sound dissolved into the wind. Slowly, I sat up, trembling so hard the sleeping bag rustled like dry leaves, and the smell of smoke mixed with cold air stung my lungs. My mind clawed for logic, run, hide, wake the others, but everything inside me was scrambled, like fear had wiped clean the part of me that made rational decisions. The shelter's shadows felt alive, stretching toward me as if urging me to get up before it was too late. I stumbled to my feet, grabbed my pack, and stepped outside into the night, where the moon hung too bright and the forest felt impossibly vast. Every tree looked like a figure waiting, every branch like a hand reaching to pull me back. The only thing I could think was that he was still out there, watching. The trail stretched ahead in pale moonlight, twisting through the dense woods like a path carved through another world, and every step felt like walking deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My hearing sharpened under fear, every rustle became a threat, every snap of a twig a countdown, and soon I could no longer tell what was real and what my mind created in panic. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see him at the edge of the trees, that same hollow gaze fixed on me as if this was all some terrible ritual he'd performed before. The woods felt wrong, unnaturally still, as though even the night creatures were watching from hidden places, aware of something I couldn't see. A strange dizziness washed over me, a thick fog settling in my thoughts, making the trail waver beneath my feet. I didn't know if it was fear, exhaustion, or something else entirely, but my legs felt heavier with each step, and somewhere behind me, faintly, distantly, came the soft crunch of footsteps matching my pace. I wanted to shout, to call for help, but the forest swallowed every sound before it left my lips, absorbing my whisper like it never existed. My vision blurred as shadows bled together, stretching across the ground as if guiding me toward some unseen place. I stumbled, dropping to my knees on the cold dirt, breath shaking as I fought the overwhelming sense that I wasn't just being followed, I was being herded. The footsteps grew closer, steady and patient, like the rhythm of someone who knew there was no need to hurry. I forced myself up, pushing deeper into the woods, off the trail, branches clawing at my arms like fingers trying to drag me back. The night around me pulsed with a strange energy, a hum beneath my skin that made my heart shudder unevenly. And then, clear as day, I heard him whisper my name, not Jonathan, my actual name, a name I had never spoken to him. I froze, the world tilting sideways, a wave of nausea rolling through me as my mind tried to make sense of something impossible. How did he know me? How long had he been watching me before tonight? Every instinct screamed that the truth ran deeper than a random encounter, that he hadn't just chosen me at the shelter, he'd been waiting for me. The footsteps stopped just beyond the tree line, too close, too deliberate, the darkness swallowing everything except the soft sound of his breathing. I didn't turn around, I couldn't. Something told me that looking at him would break whatever thin thread was keeping me alive. Then the woods fell silent again. Then, silence swallowed everything. I don't remember falling, I don't remember the impact. I only remember waking up somewhere else entirely, a place that didn't feel like the woods, or the world I came from. And whoever Rick really is, I don't think he ever left. Would you dare return to this place? The forest never felt quiet that day. Every snapping twig echoed like footsteps trailing me, and the wind scraped across the trees like skeletal fingers dragging over brittle bones. I had started early. Before dawn, the sky, a bruised shade of purple bleeding into gray. The Appalachian peaks looming like silent sentinels. My pack was heavy, straps biting into my shoulders, and every breath I took seemed to shiver in my chest. Shallow, sharp, alive. For weeks I had walked this trail, mapping its rhythms, noting the cadence of the river and the rustle of wildlife, believing solitude would clear my mind. But lately, the solitude had begun whispering back, as if the trees themselves were watching, bending unnaturally toward me in the early light. I shook my head, trying to laugh at the feeling, but the laughter caught in my throat, brittle and unconvincing. For months, I had prepared for this hike like it was a ritual, a cleansing of all the chaos I had left behind in Atlanta. The marketing job I quit, the emails unanswered, the life I needed to reset. My journal was filled with notes about pace, gear, and mental strategies, and my blog chronicled each day in humor and discovery. At first, the trail had felt like freedom, like air filling lungs that had been suffocating under fluorescent lights. I laughed with strangers at shelters, traded stories over campfires, and watched the sky turn every shade imaginable from dawn to dusk. Yet in North Carolina, everything had begun to change. The shadows seemed to linger a second too long. Every other hiker looked familiar, yet wrong. Their smiles slightly off, their movements synchronized in ways I couldn't understand. Something about it tightened my chest, and I found myself checking behind every bend, under every fallen log, as though the forest itself had teeth. Sleep became impossible, even in the safety of shelters. I avoided them, telling myself the wind would be a lullaby, the rustling leaves a blanket. But the more isolated I became, the more aware I was of the patterns, someone always arriving after me, leaving before I woke. I convinced myself it was coincidence at first, rationalized it with daylight and trail timing, yet every fiber of me screamed otherwise. At Hot Springs, I stocked up on extra supplies, my hands trembling slightly as I examined maps and side trails that promised escape from the main path. The store clerk's eyes lingered, suspicious or concerned. I couldn't tell which hand when I answered his simple questions with vague explanations. I felt a weight in my chest, an urgency that had nothing to do with hunger or water. The idea of being watched had grown roots, twisting deeper with every step, every glance over my shoulder. Angela, a fellow hiker, tried to reason with me, her voice soft, gentle, tethering me to reality, but I could only shake my head. "You don't understand," I said. "It's not in my head. Someone is out there, always watching, blending in, waiting." Her eyes searched mine, trying to locate the logic I had lost. And I envied her certainty, her calm, but I could not share it. I left Hot Springs before dawn the next morning, the blue blaze trail unfolding in front of me like a spine of shadows. Each step was measured, urgent, faster than usual, as if running from something I could neither see nor name. The forest seemed to close behind me, the underbrush thickening unnaturally, the birds silent in their perches, and yet, when I paused, convinced I had lost it, I heard it, a faint cracking, far behind, and my pulse roared in my ears. The day wore on, and I felt eyes on me everywhere. Trees that had stood for centuries bent slightly, leaves trembling though there was no wind. Streams gurgled with whispers I could not place. I passed day hikers who nodded politely, unaware of the weight pressing on my back, unaware of the figure that seemed to linger in the corner of my vision, vanishing when I turned. The trail twisted and climbed, and with every step, the feeling intensified, a crescendo of anticipation that made my legs ache and my mind spiral. Then, at a junction, I paused, map in hand, trying to reconcile the directions with the terrain. That's when I saw it, movement in the underbrush, deliberate, slow, just out of reach. And then, silence swallowed everything. The quiet lasted a heartbeat too long. My instincts screamed, and I moved, faster, boots slapping against packed dirt, the undergrowth clawing at my shins. Branches snapped sharply, breaking the fragile stillness like gunshots. But there was no one, at least no one I could see. Every instinct told me to flee, to leave the trail, to vanish into the shadowed forest. But the path twisted strangely ahead, unfamiliar, as though the mountains themselves had rearranged. My breaths were short and ragged. I checked behind again, nothing, but the sensation persisted. Someone or something tracking my every step, a presence so patient it could wait forever. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt fractured, stretched thin. I stumbled into a clearing and froze. The sun was falling fast, painting the sky blood red, and the wind had grown louder, moaning, whispering my name. I wanted to scream, but my voice failed me. Then I saw the footprints, faint but deliberate, veering off the main trail onto a narrower, almost invisible path. I didn't follow them, I couldn't, but they confirmed my fear. Someone had been here, just ahead, testing me, trailing me. My legs shook, but I pressed forward, each step a negotiation with terror, each heartbeat echoing in my skull. The blue blaze markers faded into shadows, and the forest thickened, trees stretching like towering specters, their trunks blackened in the dying light. A creek appeared, its surface gleaming like liquid silver, deceptively calm. I knelt to drink, the chill biting my hands, but something was wrong. The sound of my own movements seemed doubled, mirrored, like another me moving in tandem. I spun around, nothing but a shadow detached itself from the tree line, only to vanish when I blinked. My mind wavered. Was it exhaustion, dehydration, paranoia, or was I finally seeing what had been following me all along? I stumbled along the blue blaze, ignoring side trails, refusing shelter, desperate to outrun the feeling of unseen eyes pressing against my back. Then, the wind shifted, carrying a whisper, indecipherable, urgent, and I knew I was not alone. The path narrowed to a knife-edge trail, steep on one side, descending sharply into brush on the other. Panic clawed at me. My legs carried me, faster than they should, heart hammering like a drum of warning. Every sound was magnified, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, a faint laugh, or was it the wind? I risked a glance behind, nothing, but the feeling persisted. Shadow and weight combined into one relentless presence, stalking, patient, invisible. Then, a sudden clearing opened ahead, and I froze, seeing the remnants of old shelters, abandoned, half collapsed. Something moved between them, a figure, perhaps, and before I could react, it vanished into the tree line again, leaving only the echo of its passage and my own ragged breath. Night fell faster than it should, the forest closing in, every familiar landmark distorted, twisted by shadows. I stumbled blindly, following faint markings on the trail, but they too seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, as if the woods themselves were alive, reshaping, hiding. I found a small overhang to rest, curled into myself, eyes straining against the darkness, listening to every sound, every rustle, every impossible whisper. And then I saw it in the corner of my vision, a light, barely perceptible, moving, following, mimicking my every motion. I held my breath, but when I blinked, it was gone, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own panic thrumming in my chest. What was real? What was imagined? And did it even matter anymore? I moved again, each step a defiance against the forest's creeping malevolence. The trail twisted endlessly, side paths snaking into blackness, but I kept the main line, hoping, praying for some sign of civilization. And then, just before dawn, I realized I was completely alone, truly alone, without footprints, without trail markers, without sound beyond the wind and my own heartbeat. The last thing I remember before disappearing into the forest was the sensation of being watched, not just from behind, but from above, the trees themselves leaning in, alive, sentient, judging, waiting. No one has seen me since, no trace remains. My blog frozen, my family searching, the mountains silent, but I know whatever followed me is still out there, patient, hidden, and perhaps I was never meant to be found. Would you dare return to this place? The wind scraped across the trees as I tightened the straps on my backpack, the sound grating against my nerves like fingernails on slate. Summer had draped the Appalachian Trail in warmth, but the evening air carried an odd chill that crawled beneath my skin. I'd been hiking for days, alone, tracing the path through Virginia with nothing but my own rhythm and the distant calls of birds to keep me company. My boots crunched along the dirt, each step echoing slightly too loud in the empty forest, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I'd always trusted my instincts, but tonight they were screaming. I paused, listening, and for a brief second, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Something was out there, something patient, watching. By the time I reached the shelter that evening, the sun was bleeding into orange streaks across the horizon, painting the surrounding woods in shadows that twisted unnaturally. The structure was empty, quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost expectant, like the air itself was waiting. I set my pack down, filtered water from the nearby stream, and prepared a simple meal, my hands shaking slightly from the long hike. The smell of cooked oats mingled with pine resin, the forest scents usually comforting, now vaguely threatening. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on my arms were standing on end, every rustle of leaves making me tense. Then he appeared, as if drawn out of the shadows themselves, an older man, eyes sharp, body tense, like a predator waiting for its prey. He said his name was Randy. He asked questions that felt far too precise, probing the kind of details strangers shouldn't need to know where I was headed, whether anyone would be expecting me, how long I planned to stay. His gaze lingered too long, drilling into me in a way that made my stomach churn. I nodded, forcing casual responses, though my gut screamed at me to leave, to vanish into the forest before the sun fully set. He positioned himself oddly, blocking the shelter entrance with deliberate subtlety, fingers constantly brushing a bulge under his jacket. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, but I reminded myself of trail etiquette, the idea that refusing someone shelter could be impolite. Still, the weight of unease pressed against me, thick and suffocating. I pretended to settle into my sleeping bag, pulling it close around me, the fabric scratchy but comforting. I told myself I'd sleep, but I kept my knife in my hand, eyes half closed, ears straining for the faintest whisper of movement. Every snap of a branch, every sigh of the wind, made my heart jerk in my chest. Shadows seemed to slither along the walls, stretching too far, bending unnaturally. I caught glimpses of him moving, always just on the edge of vision, always making sure I knew he was awake. My mind raced, connecting dots that didn't want to exist. Then, silence swallowed everything. Dawn came slowly, pink and fragile, spilling over the horizon, and I packed my gear with trembling hands. The older man watched me leave but did not follow, his presence lingering in the chill morning air like a shadow I could not shake. I hiked quickly, the forest now alive with bird calls and rustling leaves. Yet every turn in the trail seemed familiar in a way that set my teeth on edge. Hours passed, and no matter how fast I moved, there was a nagging certainty, a dread that someone or something was still behind me. Every overlook, every clearing, every shallow stream felt like a trap, and I couldn't tell if it was fear or intuition keeping me tense. Over the next 3 days, I began noticing him everywhere, at junctions, near water sources, lurking just behind me in the corners of my vision. He appeared alone, silent, patient, always watching. My routine became erratic, skipping shelters, hiding behind foliage, whispering plans to other hikers I cautiously trusted. His presence was relentless, a shadow glued to my path, a reminder that the wilderness could be less forgiving than any city street. Anxiety gnawed at me with every step, every echoing crunch underfoot. And yet, I pushed onward, fueled by a mixture of fear and determination to escape. I realized then that my instincts hadn't just been warnings, they had been lifelines. That night, I stayed awake again, pretending to sleep, knife ready, watching every flicker of movement. Every snap of a twig outside the shelter made my breath hitch, my pulse thundering in my ears. His silhouette prowled the edges of my vision, deliberate, silent, testing boundaries without overtly attacking. I kept shifting, small movements to signal that I was aware, that I was not helpless. My mind spun with scenarios, each darker than the last, imagining the fate of hikers who weren't as alert. Fear had sharpened every sense, heightened every sound, and I finally understood the fine line between life and death on this trail. The next morning, I didn't wait for sunlight to strengthen. I moved before it fully broke the horizon. My backpack heavy, but my pace urgent. The woods were alive, yet every noise sounded predatory, every breeze suspicious. He was there, just behind me. I could feel the invisible tether of his attention like a brush of cold fingers against my spine. My heart hammered, legs burning, but I forced my movements to be calm, calculated, measured. Each step was survival, each glance over my shoulder a strategy. The forest seemed endless, and yet I felt trapped in a corridor of intent I could not escape. I changed routes, seeking hidden clearings and obscure side trails, but he adapted, appearing at overlooks, at streams, at junctions, always a few steps behind. Panic began to thread through my reasoning. attention coiled tightly around my chest. Sleep deprived, I remained alert, senses frayed yet precise. Hearing his approach before I could see him, noticing every irregularity in the forest's patterns. My journal entries from that week, scribbled in trembling script, read like a survival manual: stay alert, trust instincts, don't let him know fear. Every word was a lifeline. The trail itself became a chessboard, with him plotting moves I could barely anticipate. That night, I pretended to sleep in a hidden alcove, leaves brushing against my face, knife clenched in hand. My breath came in shallow bursts, every shadow a potential threat. I could hear him moving through the shelter system, and with each shuffle, the hair on my arms stood taller. My mind raced. If he was capable of what history suggested, what chance did I have if I faltered? And then I understood. It wasn't just the trail, it was him. A force I could not predict, a ghost of past horrors walking among the living. The calm of the night contrasted with the terror I felt, amplifying it to an almost unbearable degree. I hiked faster the next day, cutting off planned stops, sleeping in concealed spots, avoiding paths where he might anticipate me. Other hikers corroborated my fears, recounting encounters that chilled me to the bone. Intrusive questions, prolonged staring, discomfort so sharp it felt like a warning. I realized his pattern. He selected, he watched, he tested, but he never attacked unless he saw weakness. My life became a series of calculated movements, awareness sharpened to the extreme, intuition honed to a razor edge. The trail, once a sanctuary, had become a stage for a predator's patient game. By the end of the third day, I abandoned my hike entirely, driving back to Pennsylvania with my nerves raw and my mind spinning with the horror of what I'd narrowly escaped. Sleep was fitful, haunted by the memory of those eyes, by the persistent shadow that had trailed me. Weeks later, news arrived that Randall Lee Smith had struck again, firing on 2 unsuspecting men near the same trail. The chaos of his violence reigniting the fear I had carried like a second skin. My journal, my vigilance, had been crucial in understanding his patterns, yet it could not erase the terror he inflicted on others. Even now, years later, I replay every moment on the trail: the rustling leaves, the unnatural stillness, the cold stare. I teach trail safety, cautioning hikers to trust instincts, to never ignore the subtle unease that whispers at the edge of awareness. The trail remains beautiful, the forest serene in daylight, but the memory of being hunted lingers, a reminder that evil can exist in even the most peaceful places. Would you dare return to this place, knowing what shadows might be waiting for the unwary, silent and patient, just beyond your sight? I still walk the trail, cautious, alert, never forgetting the razor-thin margin that once separated me from being another victim lost to the wilderness. I can still feel the chill of that October air pressing against my skin, the kind that seeps into your bones before you even notice it. The Appalachian Trail stretched ahead like a ribbon of color and shadow, the autumn leaves glowing like embers beneath the fading sun. I had left Austin behind for this, my work, my apartment, the constant hum of life, all traded for the quiet that only the forest could offer. My boots crunched over fallen leaves as I adjusted my backpack and tried to shake the growing sense that I wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle, the sound of twigs snapping just out of sight, or a shadow that didn't quite match the trees. I told myself it was nothing, that it was the wilderness reminding me of its presence, yet my stomach knotted every time I caught movement from the corner of my eye. The more I hiked, the heavier the silence became, and I began recording everything, snapping pictures and writing notes as if documenting reality could hold back whatever was pressing in around me. The first week felt normal enough. I marveled at the trails, met other hikers, and shared stories around small campfires. My camera captured landscapes that made my heart pound with all the gold and crimson leaves, the streams curling around moss-covered rocks, the sun setting behind peaks that felt eternal. But even then, something felt off, though I couldn't name it. I noticed hikers passing me, but their eyes never met mine. They moved with a kind of urgency I didn't understand, as if the forest itself whispered warnings I couldn't hear. By October 12th, the air had grown colder, and my journal entries shrank, my words clipped and uneasy. My photographs shifted to, focusing less on beauty and more on the adjacent spaces between trees, the odd shapes lurking in shadows. Something in those images made me pause. The forest looked almost alive, aware, as if it were watching back. I can still remember October 13th. I had stopped near a small clearing, the wind scraping across the leaves like skeletal fingers, and I felt it for the first timers on me, though no one was there. I wrote in my blog hesitantly, "Something feels different here. The woods are too quiet. Passed several other hikers today, but nobody would make eye contact. Are they seeing it, too?" Comments poured in from friends, curious and concerned, but I couldn't answer them. I didn't want to seem crazy. I only wanted someone to see what I saw. Shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't, bending unnaturally, and I began catching glimpses of figures at the edge of my vision. Tall, dark silhouettes, standing absolutely still among the trees, vanishing the moment I tried to focus. By October 15th, the figures became impossible to ignore. My photograph that evening showed a dark shape between two trees, vaguely humanoid, far too tall and misshapen to be human. I captioned it carefully, though my fingers shook. "Third time I have seen these figures watching from the tree line, always at dusk, always standing completely still. When I try to get closer, they're gone." Fellow hikers say they do not see anything, but I know what I'm seeing. No one could understand. The isolation made it worse. I started walking faster, looking over my shoulder, heart hammering at every snapped twig. At the GU mountain shelter on the 16th, a fellow hiker tried to reassure me that shadows played tricks on the mind, but I couldn't stop insisting these were real. Watching, waiting. The air felt heavier, and my senses sharpened in ways I couldn't explain. My tent at night became a fragile sanctuary, yet even inside, I felt their presence lingering, just beyond the thin fabric. On October 17th, I reached Neil Gap Outfitters, desperate for guidance, though I tried to mask my fear with calm. My questions about side trails and alternate routes came out clipped, rapid, almost frantic. I couldn't stay on the main trail, they were too close, too patient, supplies purchased, maps studied, yet the moment I left, dread settled on me like a second skin. By nightfall, my last blog post was brief and haunting. "They are getting closer now. Counted 7 of them surrounding my camp last night. Did not sleep. Cannot stay on the main trail anymore. Going to find somewhere they cannot follow. If you are reading this and something happens to me, look for the shadow figures. They are real." The accompanying photograph showed my tent from outside, the angle low, almost at ground level, my sleeping bag faintly visible. Then, silence swallowed everything. I awoke or thought I did to a shifting, almost imperceptible movement outside my tent. My pulse rattled against my ribs. Every snap of a branch sounded like a footstep, every rustle like a whisper. I tried to breathe normally, counting seconds, willing my racing heart to slow, but the shapes lingered, stretching, bending, impossible to focus on. My camera lay at my side, battery dead, yet my instincts screamed at me to photograph, to prove it, to leave evidence for anyone who might find me. Shadows converged just at the edge of vision, dark and unmoving, yet undeniably alive. I told myself it was exhaustion, dehydration, but the dread, the primal knowing, was too acute, too precise. The night blurred, fragmented by short, sharp shocks of awareness. My tent flaps rattled, and I swore a figure loomed just beyond the mesh, motionless, impossibly tall. I whispered into the darkness, trying to assert my presence, but the forest only breathed back silence. Fear twisted into something sharper, more articulate, shaping my every movement. I packed hastily, leaving food and supplies behind, but the moment I stepped outside, I realized the path I had known, the trail that had always guided me, no longer existed. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself, the trees twisting, roots rising like barriers, the figures following, pacing, patient. Each step I took was mirrored by shadows I couldn't place, sometimes behind, sometimes impossibly ahead. By early morning, I discovered my camera hanging from a branch, precisely at eye level. My fingers trembled as I retrieved it, hoping the images would explain something, anything. They did not. Instead, dozens of photographs stared back, taken at night, showing my campsite from angles I hadn't moved to capture. Close-ups of the tent entrance, of the sleeping bag, of shapes lurking just behind the tree's figures, impossibly tall, indistinct, yet undeniably watching. My own reflection appeared in one flash, eyes wide, terrified, and I couldn't tell where I ended and the forest began. I tried to move, but the trail forked endlessly, looping back upon itself. Every attempt to leave led me deeper into the impossible geometry of the woods. Hours became days, or maybe minutes. Time fractured. The sun rose and fell too quickly, shadows stretching and compressing like living things. I found small clearings, abandoned gear from hikers who had vanished long ago, and the shapes always waited at the edges. I began documenting obsessively, snapping photos, leaving notes, desperate to prove that I existed in some coherent reality. I cannot explain it. The forest seems alive, aware, bending its own rules. My journal entries grew jagged, frantic, yet still meticulously detailed. Each photograph, each note, became an anchor against the encroaching chaos of what I could feel but could not fully see. And then, the figures stepped closer, not in steps, not in movement I could track yet. They arrived, surrounding me, towering in ways that defied proportion. I wanted to run, but my feet refused coordination. My own voice echoed unnaturally, as though the trees repeated my words in distorted form. One figure tilted its head, almost curious, and I realized I was utterly exposed. A single human amidst entities that ignored every law of nature. I raised my camera, capturing the impossible, and in the flash, the forest seemed to inhale, and I felt myself dissolve into the shadows, a whisper lost among millions. My final photograph, taken at 4:42 a.m., shows a tree partially obscuring a tall, dark humanoid figure. I cannot tell if it is human, or something else entirely. I never returned from that clearing. Every subsequent search turned up nothing. My tent, my supplies, the forest swallowing me whole, leaving only evidence of presence, but not me. If anyone ever reads this, know that the trail is not just a path. It is a test of perception, a place where reality thins and the forest watches. Shadows linger at dusk, tall and patient, waiting for the unwary. My disappearance may have explanations that sound rational, but rationality has no hold here. What you see in the corners of your eyes may be more than imagination. Would you dare return to this place? The Appalachian Trail keeps its secrets, and some like me are never meant to be found. Somewhere, I exist in the spaces between shadow and light, a trace, a story, a warning, and the forest still waits. I knew something was terribly wrong the moment I tasted blood in the back of my throat, and the wind drifting through the Georgia pines carried a coldness that didn't belong to spring. My skull throbbed in pulses that made the forest tilt sideways, and when I opened my left eye, the crusted blood glued my lashes together. Pine needles clung to my cheek like tiny splinters, and the fading imprint of boot tracks stretched toward the shelter I'd crawled away from. I didn't remember falling into the ravine, only the sound of my attacker's breath, sharp, wintergreen, almost playful. My pack, knife, and phone were gone, leaving me with nothing but a plastic whistle rattling like a trapped insect. I told myself I wasn't dead yet, but the trees around me felt like they were waiting for that to change. Crawling became my only form of movement, because when I tried to stand, the world folded into black bit. The white blazes on the trees swam like ghosts, beckoning me south away from the shelter, away from the man who shattered my ribs and left me for the forest to devour. Every rock that scraped my palms felt like teeth, and the mud pulled at my knees as though the trail wanted to drag me under. I tried to breathe slow, but each inhale stabbed deep into my ribs like broken glass shifting under skin. The sun dipped behind the dense canopy, turning the pines into dark spears, pointing down at me. By the time night thickened, my fever had already settled in, making the shadows flicker at the corners of my vision like figures trying to stay unseen. Was he following me, or was the forest learning my shape? When thirst finally overpowered nausea, I found a thin trickle of water seeping from a rock, metallic and foul like rust scraped from old nails. I cupped it with shaking hands and swallowed, only to hunch forward seconds later as my stomach twisted in violent waves. My knees buckled and my vision pixelated into white static before settling again into grainy darkness. Every twig snap behind me sounded like his return, and I kept whipping around with a feral urgency I didn't know I had. I whispered, "Not again. Please, not again," but even my own voice trembled like a stranger's. The night felt heavier than any night I'd ever lived through, pressing down on me until my breath came shallow. As the moon drifted higher, the fever deepened, and the forest's silence grew sharp enough to cut. By dawn, I felt my body breaking down in quiet, irreversible ways. But rage kept pushing me forward, rage that he had taken my safety, my routine, my sense of control. I found a patch of sunlight on a ridge and angled the whistle's reflective surface toward the sky, flashing it in desperate arcs. My arms trembled violently, and sweat burned the raw skin on my forehead. A faint mechanical buzz answered, and for a moment hope flared like a struck match. A search drone glided overhead, small and distant, its camera glinting. I waved until my vision blurred again, but the drone drifted past, oblivious. Its battery gave a final blink before dying, its small frame disappearing behind the ridge. I held the dead device against my chest like a useless relic. The forest swallowed my last chance without a sound. As the sun lowered again, the woods shifted into a predatory quiet that made the hair on my arms lift. My ribs screamed with every movement, and when I tripped on a root, the ground slammed into me so hard I tasted iron. For a long moment I couldn't move, pinned under pain and the rising dread that the forest was slowly erasing me. When twilight finally spread through the branches, a chorus of distant howls rippled through the valley, sliding under my skin in cold waves. I forced myself up and wedged my body between two massive boulders, as though stone might protect me better than anything human could. My hand shook as I lifted the whistle and pressed it to my cracked lips. I blew until my lungs burned, the shrill note slicing through the dark, thin and desperate. Something moved in the trees, something watching. Eyes appeared first amber, reflective, like struck matches floating at the edge of the line. My breath hitched, and the whistle trembled between my fingers. The animals circled once, their bodies shifting through brush with a sound too synchronized to be coincidence. The whistle shrieked again, ridiculous and fragile, bouncing off the stone around me like a toy signal in a vast wilderness. The creatures paused, then slowly receded into the dark, their lingering presence coiling inside my chest. When they were gone, an unhinged laugh broke out of me, strange and wet, turning quickly into sobs. The sound echoed back from the rocks, warped like something else was laughing with me. Or at me. Then, silence swallowed everything. When the silence broke, it shattered in a sudden downpoured thick, relentless rain that hammered the earth like fists. My clothes clung to my skin, heavy and cold, and the mud beneath me shifted, sucking at my legs with a hungry pull. The air tasted like wet metal, and lightning stitched across the sky in jagged white flashes, each one exposing the towering forest in brief, terrifying snapshots. I scrambled under a makeshift tarp I'd shaped out of my jacket, but the rain pierced it anyway, hitting my shoulders hard enough to numb them. The fire-starting tricks I'd once heard on a podcast felt laughable now, impossible with hands that barely obeyed me. I tried anyway, whispering apologies to no one as I fumbled with dripping birch logs. The storm didn't care. It kept crushing down on me, each thunderclap shaking my fractured ribs. By the next morning, the storm had carved the trail into slick red channels, and the trees looked darker, almost charred. My fever twisted reality into soft, melting shapes. I saw my mother's disapproving face floating above the canopy, her voice drifting through the branches with that familiar mix of worry and disappointment. I whispered back apologies I didn't remember forming. My legs buckled often, and once, when I wasn't paying attention, I realized I'd wet myself without even feeling it happen. Shame barely registered anymore. Survival had stripped my dignity down to raw instinct. I kept moving because the alternative felt like sinking into the earth and becoming part of the forest's memory. Was I even still Claire, or someone else wearing the last pieces of her? Somewhere along mile marker 70 at or maybe nowhere near it, my mind cracked in small, strangely comforting ways. I began talking to the whistle, holding it in my palm as though it were alive. I named it Henry. I told Henry everything I'd been too embarrassed to say out loud. I told him my ex-boyfriend had abandoned me in the parking lot because he said I took life too seriously. I told him I was afraid. I'd never earned the promotion I'd worked years for. I told him the attacker's breath had smelled like wintergreen gum, which somehow made everything even worse. Henry listened without judgment, its cracked plastic surface warm against my feverish skin. Sometimes I wondered if it understood. As the third night descended, the forest grew strange again, quieter than before, as if holding its breath. The rain returned in violent waves, and lightning split the sky repeatedly, carving white veins across the dark. I tried starting another fire, my fingers stiff and pale. Nothing caught. I could feel the cold burrowing into my bones, slow and deliberate, like it was claiming me. I huddled beneath my jacket top, watching the storm rage with an eerie sense of detachment. Thunder rolled through the valley like distant artillery, and I imagined the mountains answering back. My heartbeat felt faint, distant, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. I whispered Henry's name just to hear a human sound in the dark. When dawn finally broke, the trail led me stumbling, half-conscious, to a narrow Forest Service road. I blinked at the sudden brightness, uncertain if the scene was real or another fever hallucination. A pickup truck sat idling on the gravel, hazard lights blinking like a pair of cautious eyes. A man stepped out, a ranger, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that smelled faintly of pine sol. His name, Patch Red Malik. and his voice carried a softness that made my throat tighten. He wrapped me in a scratchy blanket and handed me a thermos of coffee so strong it stung my tongue. Only after I stopped shaking did he ask my name. I said it slowly, like I wasn't sure it still belonged to me. Malik radioed my information, in his brow tightening as he listened. The attacker, a drifter from Ohio, had already been arrested, caught trying to pawn my watch in Dahlonega hours earlier. Relief hit me like a blunt force, almost painful. My fingers loosened, and Henry slipped out, cracked clean down the center as though it had fractured with me. I stared at the broken whistle in my palm, feeling something inside me shift in a way I couldn't name. Malik guided me into the truck gently, but I kept glancing back at the forest, half convinced it was watching me leave, half convinced it wanted me to stay. Months passed in a hospital that smelled like bleach and cheap cafeteria food. I learned to walk again under the relentless optimism of a physical therapist who called me champ with arms thick enough to crush fear itself. Every step hurt, but in a way that reminded me I was still here. On day 33, I finally reached the window overlooking the distant blue silhouettes of the Appalachians. The mountains looked peaceful, indifferent, ancient in a way that made my chest ache. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, feeling the faint hum of wind vibrating through the frame. Somewhere out there, Henry lay in the leaves waiting for someone else. Someone who didn't know the forest could listen. Someone who didn't know the trails remembered things. The thought sent a familiar shiver crawling up my spine. I leaned close to the glass, let my breath fog the surface, and whispered a warning meant for the wind itself. A warning I wasn't sure the mountains would understand. Your turn to be afraid. Would you dare return to this place? As we pull away from tonight's story and the darkness settles once more, remember, the shadows never really disappear. They only wait. They linger just outside the edge of your screen, just beyond the glow of your room, listening, watching, wondering when you'll return to them. If you think this was chilling, you're not ready for what comes next. Right here on the end screen, you'll find 7 most disturbing true Midnight Shadows horror stories, a collection that digs even deeper into the places where the night comes alive. If you dare to continue, click it, but just know once you step into those shadows, they follow you back. Before you leave, make sure you subscribe to Scary Dark Narrations, where every night we open another door you should never walk through. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next descent into darkness, because the horrors waiting ahead are only getting stranger, and much, much closer. Until then, keep quiet, keep still, and trust nothing you hear in the dark. The night remembers every visitor.